English translation 410th contact. Saturday, 21st January 2006, 12:14 hours.
Ah, you are already here. Welcome and greetings, Ptah, dear friend. Actually, I thought I was over here before you when you called earlier.
Yes, I was already here reading something in that dwarf book. You are really still interested in a lot of things, like you have been since you were a child. But be greeted, Edward, my friend. What is the matter, that you had Florina call me here? Apparently it is important. Florina was supposed to do the proofreading with Bernadette and you again today, but since I am already here, I will take over this work, although it has not been decided yet if I will have time to come back to your workroom afterwards. What is so important that you have called me?
Today I have a question that once again refers to the USA group. If I am not mistaken, you are watching, at least here and there, what happens there, because I asked you to do so some time ago. It is quite obvious that there is something simply not right there, because unfortunately I keep hearing complaints from various quarters about the USA group, with quite regrettable complaints about the organization, leadership and lack of interpersonal relations, and the equality and equal rights of all members. There are only a few members, but still nothing seems to work. Again and again there are complaints directed at WM, because he treats members harshly and unfairly, does not consider them to be full members, and simply ignores their interests with regard to group matters, etc. Why is it that nothing works properly in the US group? Do you know more about this? Is it really only because of WM?
Yes, that is correct. You have addressed the sore point. And as you say, we are observing the whole thing quite closely, but unfortunately we had to realize that in most of the matters we criticized, nothing has changed in a serious form yet. The U.S. group has really not yet established itself as such, but everything has remained the same. The great evil lies in the lack of proper organization, and in the lack of equality and equal rights for all members, namely the men and women who unfortunately still exist in very small numbers and who have not yet found common ground. The main reason for the whole thing, that nothing or hardly anything is flourishing in a proper wise, is that WM is still continuing in the old style, which I had already criticized years ago via Florina. Obviously, he has not learned much from my reprimand, even if he wrongly believes that the opposite is the case. He is constantly striving to use his power, not to consider others as equal and not of equal value, and to disregard their objections and suggestions. This is a fact that leads to certain members either becoming servile to him or not daring to openly express their opinions, ideas, and suggestions and act in the right wise. These members feel justifiably disregarded and oppressed, which inevitably leads to permanent differences and to a lack of agreement and cohesive community. WM is the person who has the most to learn in this and many other relationships, because his might-hungry nature constantly urges him over and over again to exercise a leading role in arbitrariness. In any case, a leadership role can only be the form of a leadership which does not have to determine, but only to accept and carry out the decisions of the whole group. Therefore, he does not have to determine, but rather to let the group members determine in a fair manner and in accordance with the statutes all things whose decisions must then be carried out. It is not acceptable for him to influence the individual group members in their decisions according to his own ideas and will in order to bring them on his side. And it must be said that each individual member has a right to speak, to object, to ideas and suggestions, which must be discussed as a whole group in order to then vote on them if necessary, without any decisive influence by WM, in order to strive for a decision according to his will. Every member of the group has his or her own voice, his or her own will and the right to judge and decide according to their own opinion. And this must be accepted and understood by him without any objection and without harassing or denigrating members in any form if they have a different opinion and decision than he has. He must learn, and most urgently, that he is not the powerful one of the group, not a master, not a guru, and not a ruler, but solely a group member like any other, with exactly the same duties and rights, no more and no less. He still has a lot to learn. Learn to be humble and to respect and treat all group members in the same wise and to accept their peculiarities, characters and personalities, and to grant them exactly the same rights as he claims for himself. He must learn that he does not have to lead with the final say and not to give orders, because he has no other rights than all group members. In this respect, he must put himself in his place and rein in his nature, which is oriented towards domination and self-empowerment. Only in this kind and wise is it possible for the still loose and not yet established group to finally become a cohesive community. It is extremely regrettable that after so many years, this loose group has still not become a real, solid, valuable, and stable group. A real leadership is really of urgent necessity, if a true group is finally to be formed from it, as it is in our sense and in the sense of Figu. Of all the Figu groupings, only the USA has these great problems, which even after so many years have still not been solved. However, we knew very early on that such problems occur in the USA as a result of the often wrong mentality, which is why we distanced ourselves from direct intervention or even open contacts there. We only tolerated the whole thing because the core group members agreed to strive for a USA group. However, the untenable situation in the USA group does not change immediately within the framework of all that is necessary, then we must advise to dissolve the Figu USA group or to place it under a different management than that of WM. These are the facts which I have to mention, and this should also be said, if the necessary change does not take place soon, then we must radically end the matter of the present, and for many years, continuing very bad state of the USA group in one form or another mentioned. These are our findings, and it is desirable that my words be translated into English and sent to all members or as an open letter to the USA group for reading at their next official general meeting or publication in the newsletter. The choice of sending letters, etc., should be decided by the core group.
This is a frank and clear statement. But now, Ptah, we have to finish our conversation, because it is time for me to go over to the living room where we will start the correction work later. Perhaps we will see each other again later.
Possibly, but that will come up in the course of the work.
Okay, then we can buzz off. Or do you want to stay here alone?
No, I want to prepare everything for the correction work.
So I will see you later. See you again next time. So here we are again, and here I have another question that we should clarify in a moment. Precisely what we came across in the correction work.
I have already done that. It is not about the 26th of April, but about the 25th of April, 1976, which was a Sunday. There is still one mistake in Volume 2 that needs to be corrected, and that is at the 50th contact conversation, because the 6th of April, 1976 was not a Sunday, but a Tuesday, which should be corrected.
Unfortunately, again and again errors occur which are overlooked in the correction work by the correction group.
Errors, but they still have to be corrected.
Of course. Bernadette always irons everything out in the original so that the annoying mistakes are gone for a later print, at least those that are found. Unfortunately, there are always mistakes, which is not only the case with us, because when you go through other people's books, newspapers, and journals, You always find mistakes there too, and sometimes worse than with our writings and books, etc.
The corrections should be carried out in a more concentrated manner, but it must be said that nevertheless mistakes can always be overlooked. The human being is afflicted with the fact that he or she commits mistakes and is not perfect in his or her attention. If this were different, then he or she would not need to learn.
Tell me about it, my friend.
Of course.
Then I would like to address something that we, also Ketzel and I, once talked about privately, which therefore has not been recorded in a report. Andreas asked me about it. If I may recite what was said in various conversations, 251st Contact, 3rd February, 1995. So 2 great races of genetically manipulated peoples escaped from the Sirius regions and settled beyond the sun, which means that they settled on very remote solar systems, or, respectively, planets beyond the galaxy's central sun, the Milky Way's central sun. This means that they settled down and established themselves on very distant solar systems or planets beyond the central sun of the galaxy, the central sun of the Milky Way, in order to be discovered by astronauts of the old Lyran lineage, after which they emigrated to the Lyra regions, and finally came to this planet in more recent Earth history, where they settled in China and Japan, etc., and formed the Chinese and Japanese peoples, from which various new branches or so-called races emerged.
231st Contact, the 9th of November, 1989.
That is of correctness. More than 25,000 years ago, the real ancestors of the Chinese were immigrants from a region beyond your galaxy, which is why they called it beyond the sun, meaning the galactic central sun, in which the galactic black hole moves. The actual primeval humans in China lived more than 2 million years ago. After the immigration of the strangers from beyond the Milky Way, the much later Earth-born natives who lived in the areas where present-day China is became extinct in the course of time. They died as a result of an incurable hereditary disease that spread when they mingled sexually with the new immigrants from beyond the sun. All this knowledge, however, as well as the knowledge about space technology and many other things, was lost, as was the knowledge about the original origin of the immigrants. From the indigenous people alone, who enlivened the ancient Chinese territories and created certain small cultures, the immigrants from beyond the sun, that is to say, the real ancestors of today's Chinese people, took over many cultural values of the indigenous people. Then later again, a great cultural change took place during the Bronze Age, namely as immigrants.
236th Contact, the 26th of April, 1990.
The yellow peoples of the Chinese and Japanese, they are the youngest inhabitants on Earth, because their appearance on this planet was only a little more than a cosmic age ago, and that was pretty much 25,978 years ago. They came here from the planet Nissan in the vicinity of Laysan in the Lyra systems. But before that, and this has only been researched in recent years, they lived beyond the sun on a planet called Kudra, in a solar system called the Nissan system. They came to the Lyra systems and to Nissan 2.4 million years ago because they had to emigrate due to overpopulation. And they found their way to our original home planets through an ancient Lyra expedition fleet, which went beyond the sun and met the planet Kudra in the Nissan system, and there again, the yellow race.
And where's this other side of the sun? If I am informed correctly, then by the sun you do not mean our sun, and also not a sun of the old Lyra systems, but you are referring to that sun which we know as the central sun of our Milky Way?
That corresponds to the circumstances, yes.
So that's it. For this, I would like to ask you to explain the most important thing another time, so that I can then call it up and put it down in writing.
We should have done this earlier because it was obvious that there would be more questions. Then, therefore, the direct ancestors of the yellow races, as the races of China and Japan are called with you on Earth, came to Earth 25,094 years ago, counted from today back, and settled in the areas of today's China and Japan. Their very distant ancestors were at very early times or millions of years ago, like the white, red, and brown races, part of the refugees from the Sirius areas, which were shifted to the Dern spacetime structure. The yellow races first settled in distant regions beyond the Sun or central Sun, where they founded large races in the Nisan system on a planet called Kudra, and created a huge overpopulation. As a result, in addition to the fact that the planet was slowly becoming uninhabitable, a great emigration took place about 2.4 million years ago, with large masses migrating and settling in the Lyra systems on this side of the central Sun on a neighboring planet of Lasan. Their planet was called Nisan. These systems and planets in the Lyra regions were also offset to our space-time structure by fractions of a second or seconds, whereas the Nisan system and its planets, thus also Kudra, beyond the galaxy belong to the Dern space-time structure. Now it must still be said that about 2.4 million years ago, when the emigrants set out from Kudra and moved to the Lyra regions, a certain part also came to Earth and settled already in the areas of today's China and Japan, where also already Earth-born human beings existed. The early emigrants from the Kudra peoples who settled on Earth were left to their fate without any technical achievements, because the transport ship that should have brought the technical materials never arrived on Earth but remained lost. Thus, the immigrants were also deprived of the technology that would have enabled them to contact the emigrants in the Lyra systems. This resulted in them being forgotten. 25,194 years ago, Nisan was once again overpopulated, and larger groups of emigrants were formed to pursue investigations in regard to other emigrants in the past. So they also came across the Earth and the areas of today's China and Japan, which resulted in migrations to these areas on the Earth and the resettlement of today's China and Japan, including the merging with the very distant descendants of the former emigrants and with the Earth-born ones. These later immigrants came to Earth by popular decree, free of any technology, to find a new beginning, which should prevent another problem of overpopulation from arising. Nevertheless, the peoples retained their knowledge and their sense of invention, and consequently, despite the lack of technology, they continued to make technical progress, albeit in a kind and wise that no longer corresponded to the old technical forms. The tendency towards overpopulation has continued to this day. It should also be mentioned that the two yellow races were never on good terms with each other, which is why they were constantly engaged in strife, which often led to armed conflicts.
Thank you. That is clear. But can you say anything else about one of the Henok personalities, who was also with those distant descendants of the Nocodemian line on the other side of the Milky Way, as well as on Nisan?
It is only to be said that one of the Henok personalities acted as a prophet among the yellow people, both on Kudra in the Nisan system beyond the galaxy and on Nisan in the Lyra regions. Unfortunately, however, his efforts were pushed into the background and disregarded, as has been the case since time immemorial with many peoples of the Nocodemion lineage and also with races who otherwise came into contact with it, the teaching. Also on Earth it happened likewise when Enoch appeared several times, of course always as a new personality and later also under different names. None of the races of the Nocodemian lineage was ever left without his prophetic lineage, and that is until today. Of course, Since ancient times, there have always been other prophets in all races who did not originate from the lineage of Nocodemion, and this has been preserved until today, and it will continue to be so. But the Nocodemian lineage of prophets remains, even if today and in the future the prophets of the Nocodemian lineage who appear, always as new personalities, do not appear in person with all of his distant descendants, as it was the case in former times when the prophets of this line were still travelers through the world's space and visited the most different races on distant planets. This time is over, because today, the technological means of communication are used, and for the first time a prophet from the Nocodemians' lineage has appeared, who has mastered the written language in great skill and has written down everything in writing by himself, whereby it is spread in this fashion, namely among all of Nocodemians' descendants in the universal expanses. In fact, this form of proclamation of a prophet appears for the first time, which finds its reason in the fact that today all descendants of Nocodemion are sufficiently educated in terms of their consciousness-based and spiritual concerns to such an extent that they can learn through the written language. Of course, there is still a need for spiritual guides who make necessary interpretations and also teach the people orally. But this is done within the framework of the teaching of the prophet of the Nocodemian lineage. Accompanying prophets who do not belong to the Nocodemian lineage, but who nevertheless carry out tasks, are independent teachers and proclaimers who, through logic and rationality, bring those things of truth teaching which they grasp and understand, whereby the deep insights and truths of the deeper spiritual teaching are not known to them, but only those which have been taught by the prophets of the Nocodemian lineage since ancient times. Such prophets outside of the Nocodemian lineage were also active in large numbers among the yellow races, although it turned out, as with all nations, that false prophets appeared who created false philosophies, from which religions and sects often developed, whose false philosophies and ideas have partly survived until today, which is also the case on the earth.
Aha, so that is how it is. One piece of news is neatly woven into your explanation. I see. I really did not know these things, because I never was concerned about them. But now I realize some of the things you have talked about lately in relation to our writings and books.
It should be said once, just for understanding. All the written material has also reached immense mass. Monstrously diligent, as was Nocodemian, the forefather of his races and prophetic lineage, and through his spirit form and total consciousness block, the lineage is maintained until the time of return to the level of Arahat Athersata.
Of course, it cannot be helped. Still, I did not know that written communication could make such wide waves. Perhaps I have suspected it recently because Bernadette made a remark to that effect.
Which I picked up on your thoughts, which is why I thought an explanation was now appropriate.
Your calculation is phenomenal. Everything fits the concept.
So my time is over again, because my explanation took longer than my time here with you was intended. So farewell, my friend. Goodbye.
Bye, Ptah. It was a pleasure talking to you today as well.